Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Welcome back to the Human Risk podcast. As we live in uncertain times, one of the things we're seeing a lot of is unintended consequences. Plans that are made based on presumptions that turn out not to be valid, or where side effects turn out to be of greater importance than the intended outcome, are all too common. We all know intuitively that humans are sometimes not very good at seeing the full picture and predicting exactly how things will turn out. It's something that my guest Paul Orlando has been studying for some time. Paul's day job is helping companies to grow. He's the founder of Startups Unplugged, helping companies to develop new products and markets. He's also an adjunct professor at the University of Southern California, where he operates an incubator and accelerator. Paul is also the author of a blog called Unintended Consequences. There's a link to that in the show notes. In his blog, he looks at unintended consequences and a failure to engage in what Paul calls second-order thinking. As he explains in the introduction to his blog, many problems don't just happen, they are made. In an interconnected world, we should gain an understanding of systems, complexity, and causes of unintended consequences. Those who do that thrive, those who don't risk ruin. Paul's covered topics like autonomous vehicles, what of course could possibly go wrong there, universal basic income, and whether we create shoplifters. What Paul writes is challenging and thought-provoking, and I love reading it. So I was delighted when he agreed to come on the show. So please enjoy my conversation with Paul Orlando on unintended consequences. Paul, welcome to the Human Risk podcast.
Thank you, Christian. Really happy to be here.
It's great to have you here because you've been someone I've wanted to get on for some time. And before we come on to talk about unintended consequences, I would love if you could sort of just give my listeners a little bit of a sort of pen portrait as to who you are, because I think that's really helpful for us to understand a little bit more about where you're coming from in your writing.
Absolutely. So I'm Paul Orlando, and I actually come to this topic, I suppose, in a little bit of a different way. So my background is mostly, working in entrepreneurial endeavors, working in technology. Currently, teaching at the University of Southern California in Los Angeles. But I suppose the topic of our talk today is really a little outside of my day-to-day work or my recent past. So I write a blog called Unintended Consequences, and if you just search Unintended Consequences blog, I will probably come up on top. I managed to choose two very long words that were difficult to spell as the domain name. But I've been writing this blog for a little more than 2 years. And really it started as just kind of a hobby, something I was doing on the side. There were a few little sparks of interest in the past that got me going in this direction. And then once I saw a bit of the reaction that people would have to what I was writing, it encouraged me to keep going. So I've been doing this more or less weekly for about 2 years. And this is, and I'm happy this is how we, kind of got connected, as well. So I've become a fan of your work, in the meantime, and I'm very happy to share a little more about that today.
Fabulous. And I think this is just really interesting. This is a kind of extracurricular piece in that you're not a sort of risk manager or somebody that's come out of that discipline. You just have a natural curiosity about the world that led you to sort of look at what you beautifully call second order thinking. And I wanted to just unpick what you meant by that. And maybe if you can give us an example of the sort of what would you classify as second order thinking?
Sure. So I would say if your listeners or if you're speaking to somebody and you're talking about, an event of the day, something in the news, something that you've experienced, often the way that we approach the way we look at the world is it's okay. Event A happens, it causes B to happen, and we kind of call it a day at that. It's very linear. It's, something causes something else. And the second order thinking or second order effects, the different ways that you could term this, what that brings out is thinking another step. So A might cause B, but then what happens as a result of B? So it's not necessarily as predictable. It's not necessarily as easily understood. And if you start to dig into a little of the examples we have from history and things that people thought would happen when they took some type of action, that very often end up going in a very different direction. We start to learn a little bit more about systems. We start to learn a little bit more about how well we can predict. So, those second order, or if you prefer third order, fourth order, you can keep going as far as you like. Those second order effects, second order, thinking helps try to step through, that process, a little further. And my to be honest, the way I often will approach a topic is I might see something in the news and then it reminds me of something that I read 20 years ago. And then there's some other little story, and then I start to try to form and do a little research, and I start to kind of form this this hopefully a little fuller understanding of a process that has taken place or a system that has emerged in a way that was unexpected. That appreciation for second order thinking, I think, is something that can be very beneficial to anyone in the jobs that they are doing, especially if you have some top-down authority and you're able to move things or have a little bit a bit of a greater impact with less time, greater scale. I think you'll end up at least appreciating the world in a different way if you start to take this perspective.
So implicitly in this exercise and its way of looking at the world is the idea that a decision is taken and it has, as the name implies, unintended consequences. So stuff happens that you didn't plan for, and that can be good and bad. But it's just that you're thinking about something within the confines and parameters of a decision, and you're taking it potentially on the basis of limited information with a limited kind of horizon and maybe a limited view of outcomes. And what you explore is to sort of go, actually, there are some things that happened as a result of that, which weren't in the contemplation of the original decision maker, that are quite interesting. And let's explore what those are.
Yes. So, and there's an unlimited number of examples, but let's bring up a few that are maybe a little better known. So, there's a number of startups that have scaled pretty quickly. They've grown to be, international in scale in a short number of years. So, like the easy ones that come to mind, or at least some of the ones that I've looked at in this blog, include Airbnb, for example, Uber, Lyft. Interesting because they're not purely digital. They interact, they move people around, they house people, right? And these are certainly companies that have been impacted, present day with COVID-19. But some of the unintended effects that people discovered after, for example, Airbnb started to account for even just a small percentage of housing units in a given city. Some of the effects that we're seeing there was actually it was contrary to the stated mission of Airbnb. Hey, we're helping you monetize your housing. It's going to free people from being tied to one place. You can move around. And actually, a lot of the studies have shown that where Airbnb accounts for more than, it's really quite a low percentage in many of the cities of the housing units, the effect is actually it's contrary to that. So it actually helps drive up rents. You've taken inventory off the market. It doesn't make sense for a landlord to rent it out 12 months of the year, say, especially in a resort town, right? The resort town is busy a few months of the year. The rest of the time, there are, of course, still people who live there. That's their home. So if you take a few months of the year off the market because I can make multiples of a year, for the tourists who are going in, where does that leave the people who were formerly living there 12 months of the year? These are contrary effects that weren't really appreciated, and certainly as these companies moved very quickly, local regulations, we're not taking this into account. It's an effect that everything seems great until you happen to be that small population who actually feels the brunt of this. So it might be great for the company itself, not great for everybody, equally.
So an example of that, just to sort of clarify this for people, example would be, I don't know, Munich has the Oktoberfest. Little hints to everybody, that's actually in September, not October. So if you're going to Munich, beware of that. But that's an example where that's a massive thing. You can charge premium rental for that piece. And so you wouldn't let it out to someone else for in a normal way that you would do for the year. You just hold on to the property and you make an absolute killing in that week. And that, in essence, justifies you holding on to fresh. Maybe you'll pick up some other rentals as you go, but it's taken it off the market. And so that's an example. Maybe Mardi Gras in New Orleans be another example of those sorts of event-driven things where the premium is so great that it has that impact. And as you say, the nice story that is told, which is connecting travelers with authentic experiences and allowing people to invite others into that, all sounds very nice and lovely. And as you say, it's having a major impact on not just on the obvious target, which would be hotels, but actually on the less obvious target of the housing market in its entirety.
Mm-hmm.
So as you say, there's a really good example of something that's come along. That wasn't the intention. At least we'd like to hope it wasn't the intention, but it's what's happened as a result of this one decision. And both the company didn't intend it, but society wasn't ready for that impact. And so big things have happened as a result of some very small. So you've got this proverbial butterfly flapping its wings in the Amazon and causing tsunamis somewhere else.
Exactly. And that was very, very nicely stated. And the interesting effect that I think we've seen, say, in the last decade, has been as more money has flown into the startup ecosystem. There are massive funds being raised. So a company that is doing very well on a regional or even a local scale can raise a significant amount of capital, can therefore scale quite quickly. Take the model that worked, locally, and then expand it, nationally, internationally, and you end up having, they move a little too quickly for everyone to kind of catch up with them. So, another obvious, similar type of company is something like Uber or Lyft. And the interesting thing that I would see there. So, having lived in New York in the past. I would say nobody really enjoyed taking a taxi in New York. That wasn't something that you really looked for. It's not like a black cab in London. It wasn't really that type of a car.
No, it's a thoroughly unpleasant experience, exactly. Both in terms of the cramped space you sit in. I don't particularly want to smash my face into a plastic screen. Yeah, that's before I even get into the standard of driving and various other aspects of it. You're absolutely right. It was a sort of, I have to do this. And I have no choice, and it's thoroughly unpleasant, and I want to get it over and done with as quickly as possible.
No, it's so true. And in fact, I even remember now, years ago, the first time I took a cab in London, stretching my legs out and thinking, what on earth did I just? This must be one of the special ones that I just happened to
right
in here. So nobody enjoyed that experience, and when these rideshare companies started to emerge, it was an obvious improvement on the status quo. I mean, not only in the car being nicer, but also the pricing was better, right? I don't have to wait out on the street and hold my arm out for 10 minutes, hoping that I will.
For someone that won't stop, right?
Yeah, and right, and then maybe somebody else tries to steal it. So obviously it's an improvement on the experience. The pricing is better as well. And the interesting thing in New York and a number of different urban areas that had taxi commissions. Historically, they had a limit on the number of taxi medallions. So in other words, I can't just decide, hey, I want to drive a cab and start doing that the next day. There's a fixed number. In New York, it was actually 13,000 for 80 years, basically since they started that. And I think they lost a couple thousand during the Great Depression. But you had this fixed number of drivers to satisfy a population that was growing or a population that was getting wealthier and in more demand of car service. So when something like rideshare came in, it seemed to be an obvious improvement. But then what happens to the drivers who, over those years, they paid rising prices for taxi medallions, which are basically valued like a bond, right? What happens to the drivers who they can no longer make the payments? They are seeing a decline in revenues. So again, on aggregate, if you want to say, okay, well, across the entire population, seems like we're net positive. What happens to this group of people who they played by the rules as stated for years. Something abruptly changed. Now, like, what do? Do you compensate them in some way? Do you make up for this? So one of the pieces that I wrote about, it highlighted, there had been a number of, unfortunately, taxi driver suicides in New York, because all of a sudden somebody expecting to retire on the sale of their medallion, something that, will always have worth. Now it's plummeted, in worth. But again, it's a kind of thing that, these scale effects, that's another interest. I say that, that fits into unintended consequences, where you have something grow very quickly, grow like in geography, very quickly. You have these scaling effects, and the result is a little different from what you thought. So yeah, like in things that related to like housing, transportation, even certainly, what we see now in just, a much greater, or at least until a few months ago, like, a much greater, ability of, people to travel around the world at ease, at a lower cost. The increased, travel internationally, it's such a different world than it was, say, a generation ago. And so that helps, spread, things. If it's a disease, like we're dealing with now, of course, you can do that much more quickly than, in the past. And it also certainly helps spread, other business models, internationally.
So you really, when I look at what you're exploring, is kind of, it's with the benefit of hindsight, because we've seen what has happened. But I'm intrigued by this idea that when people do these things, implicit in the idea of unintended consequences is the idea it was unintended. And so I said I didn't contemplate these things. Is it all stuff that is genuinely not foreseeable? Or do you think this stuff is, it may not have been intended, but if they thought about it, they would have got there? Or are the sorts of things you're looking at so, unexpected at the time, but with hindsight obvious?
I would say, so there's a mix. Some of the effects are certainly not foreseeable. Emergence as a concept, is, perhaps unsolvable, right? We can't really fully appreciate what will happen in the future. Otherwise, we could predict the future, but then it would be different because we've predicted it, right?
Right. We're sort of in a kind of Back to the Future type thing where we're messing around with dynamics we don't fully understand. Yeah. Is time travel possible type dilemma, right?
But in other situations, I actually think that there is some level of predictability. However, the business model prevents us from wanting to do that. So I'm not, I didn't mean to harp on transportation, too much during our talk, but the other, one other topic I've written about a bit is autonomous vehicles. And there have been, billions of dollars poured into research for autonomous vehicles over the years. Many organizations have their own, research arm that's, working on this. And it's with the assumption that, the future, like it used to, when these projects were really starting 5 years ago, was actually, they were talking about 2020 as being the future. But now, that's pushed out a bit. But the future is, you push a button on your phone, an autonomous vehicle comes, it drives you somewhere else. It's going to be less expensive because there's no human driver. Traffic is going to be better because we're going to be able to route the cars more efficiently. They'll be able to drive much closer to each other. So we have all these optimization improvements. But that's all dependent upon, the business model. The business model is, we're able to pour a lot of money into R&D. We're able also to scale these businesses up. And while the margin might be a little thinner, per trip, we're transporting many more people, and we have these other efficiencies. But of course, it doesn't look at what other risk you then bring about, because the system has changed, and you have this systemic risk that emerges. So the current system of human drivers on the road, and I live in Los Angeles. To be honest, I don't mind driving in Los Angeles, but that was also because I was listening to podcasts. So I listened to your podcast and I think, oh, traffic's bad. It's all right. Maybe I can listen to one more, right?
Let me make it even worse by listening to his podcast, right?
No, so And I say, compared to driving in New York City, Los Angeles is a piece of cake. Nobody's really angry, put it that way. But a lot of the assumptions around, okay, well, in the future, we're going to replace the human drivers with autonomous vehicles. Accidents will plummet, maybe go very close to zero. The cars will run more efficiently. They will reduce traffic. So a lot of these assumptions are based on taking the system of today, drawing a straight line, to the future, and then saying, well, hey, everybody wins, right? It's safer, it's cheaper, it's more efficient. And what I ended up looking into, I wrote a couple of pieces on this theme, but the perspective that I ended up taking was, okay, this is the story that these AV companies, autonomous vehicles companies, tell today because, they might truly believe it, but it certainly is baked into the business model. I'm not going to say, okay, turn off all the the R&D because there's this risk in the future. These things are going to happen. So, but I ended up taking this very bearish view on AVs being at least mass scale in the future because this incredible amount of systemic risk then emerges. So, for example, today with human drivers, if I wanted to increase the number of accidents. So accidents in general have been going down over decades. If I wanted to increase that, what would I have to do? It's kind of impossible. I would have to change legislation and say, okay, well, 5-year-olds can drive. I would have to encourage people to drink. I would have to say, stop making those cars so safe. You don't have to do that. Cut corners. So we'd have to change. Remove lighting from the roads. It would be a very difficult task. And in general, humans try not to kill themselves, or the ones who actually are trying to do that, they're out of the gene pool pretty quickly. Maybe they take a couple other people with them, unfortunately, but they can't really have a scale effect. With a fleet of AVs, however, well, if you have a software bug that can propagate through an entire fleet, maybe it can shut down a city. If you have a group that hacks into one company's fleet, again, you can have similar effects. You could make cars do things that they're not intended to do. You also just have, even if safety is not the issue, you also have these other effects. A lot of the story is about efficiency and improved traffic. Well, if the cars are cheaper and I could get one whenever I want, maybe I don't walk. Maybe I don't take public transportation. Maybe I actually take many more trips by car than I would have ever before. So traffic becomes worse. So, these are all the second order effects that I think we could have a very robust discussion about today. And maybe we could do some things that help guard against them in the future. We're not really having these discussions that much because it's not in the interest of, companies to do this. It's not in the business model. I find a lot of I think there's a lot of opportunity to say, hey, I'm not the one to push back on innovation. I've obviously been working in technology for a long time, but we should think about, okay, if you have businesses that change an entire system at scale, what are some of the other risks that we might want to look out for, and therefore plan ahead for them?
And I think this is interesting because the counter argument to what you're saying is if imagine way back when that same logic had been applied, you wouldn't have the printing press because that would put people out of business. There's a whole load of things that wouldn't have happened. And so you could sort of look at it and say, you're a sort of modern Luddite who's trying to prevent progress, and you're coming up with all these reasons why we shouldn't do this, and you're so negative. But on the other hand, your point is entirely right, which is there's a scalability to stuff, particularly where there's a digital component, that means that these things can happen much more quickly. And it's not just the technology. I was struck by, there was something about introducing genetically modified mosquitoes to certain states of the US. Right. Well, I just read that and I went, this is Jurassic Park. Right? Now, I might be wrong, but it does seem to me slightly crazy to go, and the bit that I thought was really funny was they were introducing them into certain states. So they were only going to go to certain states as if to go, that's okay, right? Like mosquitoes are respectful of state borders. And I just kind of went, this is a remake of Jurassic Park starring mosquitoes. And it's,
Yeah.
and I think it's fascinating. And so I think the obvious piece that sort of says, well, Paul is anti-progress, right, is missing a nuance here, which is you're picking this up as very much a 21st century topic, which is because of that scalability. And because we have tools in our hands that where we can literally press a button and do something globally in a way that was probably not possible before, that's where this comes from. Is that a fair assessment?
That's very nicely stated. Yes. Yes. I hope I'm not a Luddite. Maybe I have Luddite tendencies, but you're right. The ability to scale quickly, and the mosquito example, is a perfect example of that. I understand, the intent behind the experimentation with, genetically modified mosquitoes, right? Malaria, even today, it's still a massive cause of death around the world. And, there have been a number of different projects, in these, releases of either sterilized mosquitoes or modified mosquitoes, in different parts of the world, including California. And again, the ones in California, they don't fly over to, somewhere else. And this is an example of, I just think, we might want to pause, a little bit, or like consider this more closely, because these decisions, the interesting thing on the mosquito experiments, this comes about today because a number of, there have been a number of changes, say in the last 20 years, say of gene sequencing, right? The cost of doing CRISPR, the cost of the cost of doing these experiments has plummeted. So in the past, when maybe you only could have done this through a federal government type of entity, and it would take years, and there would be massive studies that would hopefully go into this. Now these can be done by individual organizations. They can, in the future, probably in the near future, this could be done like, oh, I have a mosquito experiment going on, and I'm going to try this, in my town, and we'll just see what happens. Right? Like in theory, you might see something like that. But the interesting thing is, like, you have this argument. So, how could you possibly be on the side of maintaining deaths from malaria? Right? It's
right.
It's horrible to try to take that side. And the counter argument is, well, I'm not on that side, but I'm on the side of just wondering, do we make things worse instead? Yes, we reduce malaria deaths, but there's some other impact. And so I wrote about this a couple of times, and also in looking at some of these experiments that had been run, one in Brazil, one in California, where things went a little differently than expected, but at least so far, it didn't seem to be, as far as we know, it didn't seem to have dramatically negative effects. But the approach is also like, who has the authority to do these experiments? And this has really gone in both directions. Both populations that are affected today by malaria have actually argued both sides of this. Like, yes, it's positive or also negative, as in, we don't want to be the guinea pigs that you experiment on in these types of experiments. Maybe we should, for a little while longer, stick with things that do seem to work, bed nets, other types of medication. And we've gotten to this place, interestingly, we've gotten to this place with malaria specifically, and mosquitoes specifically, a couple of reasons. The malaria, the attempts at producing an effective malaria vaccine they're really not there, just yet. The ones that have been produced, it takes multiple treatments. The effectiveness is not very high, and there's I'd also say there's a limit on the patience that people have to continue to try that. Where maybe some of these older techniques, malaria used to be a big problem in the U.S. right, even 100 years ago. So maybe it's about water treatment. It's about not living in certain areas until the mosquitoes are controlled. Some other other types of treatments that worked in a less scalable and less a little bit of an older style approach. But for scale effects, the mosquitoes are ones that I think just give some people pause. They seem to be very promising. Who pays the price if it doesn't work out? I don't know. And even if somebody does pay the price, maybe the price is just impossible to be paid.
And so, but there's an interesting tension here between the sort of self-interest of the individuals doing the experimenting and wanting to encourage innovation and all those, and a sort of societal disbenefit. And a lot of the things you talk about, it's kind of, I can make a very compelling business case, which is why I get investment for it when we look at the things that are business investment cases. But societally, it's not something that we would want to have happen. And so somebody, you could sort of go, well, the way that you deal with this is you have regulation that prevents this. And somebody's overseeing this stuff. And we've seen, for example, in my background in the banking industry, you can kind of see what happens when that industry is left to its own devices and gets innovative and creative and all those sorts of things. And so that's in theory why you have regulation around that, because we know that they're unintended. We don't have that around tech in a way that clearly, I think, with the likes of Facebook, there's a clear demonstration that we should. And, there are lots of other things. And I guess the challenge with some of this thing is because of the unforeseen nature of it, there is always going to be this period of sort of waking up and smelling the coffee, and then regulation comes along almost when it's too late, when the damage has been done. And so that's you pose a really, you sort of present a problem and go, this is how we should think about it, and we should maybe be a bit more careful. Do you have any thoughts on how we solve that? Is the regulatory model the right one?
Oh my, this is for a smarter person than me. But the issue with regulation as being the only solution is, how should I put this? The regulators, I'll put this maybe in very casual terms, are working 9 to 5, whereas the people in the tech companies are working, 5 to 9, right? They're like, there's much more upside to getting something right, which, right doesn't mean right in the system sense, but maybe like right in the business model works. I can grow this, very quickly. There's much more incentive in getting things right there. And I think, the same thing's true in the financial industry, right? So people are going to try much harder to make these business models work, to grow. And they're always, as a result, they're kind of always going to be, half a step ahead of the regulators, who obviously have many things to look at and are maybe a little more practiced in their approach. And also don't want to take too much of a heavy hand, because obviously you want some degree of experimentation out there. You want some degree of, I'll even say you want some degree of chaos, because that's where good things happen as well as bad things. So I don't know. I think this greater degree of risk might just be something that is something we need to live with in the world, like today, in the future. In the past, centuries and centuries past, thousands of years past, where, if there were an epidemic, it would often, obviously not always in the case of plague, but often be limited to one small area. There weren't a lot of people coming in and out. You didn't need to think globally. There wasn't as much of a transmission of people or ideas. So I don't think we're going back to those times, barring a massive catastrophe. I don't think humanity goes back to that type of living, and I don't think we would want to as well. So just this greater amount of risk might just be kind of baked into modern life. There might be some ways that we could avoid intentionally creating greater risk. I don't know exactly how you do that by fiat. You might encourage people to think in this way. You might encourage more questions to be asked. But given how inexpensive experimentation, say on the mosquito side or on the AV side, are becoming with greater processing power, just new technologies that have emerged, it might just be something that we end up, needing to live with. There are already, for years, there have already been government-funded groups that look for the next emerging disease that is problematic, right? So perhaps there's something like that emerges on the technology risk side, and so it might just be another way of, okay, I can't suppress innovation. I don't want to, actually, because a lot of good things come from that. But I might also want to just create some groups that are looking out for emerging technologies, the risks that they might have, starting a discussion around that. If we start a discussion, maybe we have a way to to counteract any negative effects that could emerge.
Right, and I think it's really interesting articulation. There's a couple of things that you said that I sort of wanted to pick up on. I mean, the first of which was around this idea that why is regulation not the solution? Well, the answer, as you rightly pointed out, is that regulators don't know everything. The incentives are slightly skewed, and I would argue there's plenty of examples from history where regulators have got things badly wrong and made them worse. So there's that example in Vietnam of the rat plague,
right?
Where there was, just for listeners who aren't aware of this, where there was basically, the governor, the French governor of Vietnam at the time, basically said, we will, bring me rats and I'll pay you for them to try and get rid of these things. And of course, what do people do? They grow the rats. And then he was like, just bring me rats' tails, because I don't want this big pile of stuff. And again, that incentivized people to just pull tails off rats or even grow them on their own. And so there's a really good example of an attempted intervention that made things a damn sight worse. Right. And so that was my first sort of thought. And I think that the second one was to say that we tend to look for risk after the event. So we have auditors that come in, and we have reviews that come in, and so it occurred to me that one of the things that one might like to look at is to sort of say, well, we should shove some of the responsibility back on the people causing the problem in the first place. Not in that we try and second guess it, but we say, before you're allowed to do X, whatever X is, you need to demonstrate that you've thought about this stuff. And the court of public opinion, or maybe it's a legal court, will judge you based on how much you thought about some of these issues. So we don't put it on society to regulate it. We actually say, okay, go ahead. But if you, Mr. Zuckerberg, unleash something that is, a weapon of mass destruction from an informational perspective, we're going to hold you to that because you should have thought about that. And I wondered whether actually you could look at that through, say, the stock market. And you say you impose that, because that's one of the key things is if you create a startup, ultimately one of the exits you get is it gets floated, and that's a controlled gateway. And therefore what you would say is actually before you can go on, there'll be that's part of that process. So there's somehow, but then I thought about it and just went, well, what does that do? Right. So what are the unintended consequences of my cunning plan to solve the problem? And that, in a nutshell, goes back to the first point of why regulating this thing is really difficult, because I've intervened with stuff with a presumption that my intervention is going to be perfect. And thereby, in a nutshell, what I've illustrated is the scale of the problem. And I come up with a brilliant idea that is itself flawed, that probably would make things worse in some respects.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. These broad systemic risks, they're quite difficult to think through because there is no boundary to the system necessarily, right? We might map things out on paper, but really everything is interconnected, certainly today. So it is really interesting, like the approach of having, say, officers of a company take personal responsibility, or at least have them, have their names be known, like more broadly. Maybe it would give people a little pause. And so it's going to be interesting, because while one country might take an approach like that, it doesn't mean that every other country will. So it could be interesting, because what also could happen is, well, you end up just shifting the locations of innovation somewhere else in the world, and maybe even people will emigrate there, because this is really where I can be free and try everything I want. So it's going to be interesting just looking at the world as a whole. Do you just
right? So it's the equivalent of a tax haven, but for a responsibility haven, for want of a better phrase.
I love that. Yes, definitely.
So so you've opened this kind of Pandora's box by just kind of sort of looking around this space and going, where is this happening? Now, you've been doing this for 2 years, and sure, you cover some themes over more than one week, so it's not. But I mean, what you're starting to uncover, you're not short of content.
No, certainly not. Certainly not.
And so as I look at it, I sort of just go, does this change the way you look at the world? Does it change your own behavior? Because I find with my sort of human risk piece is I'm spending, it's exhausting, right? Because I walk around and I am interested in how they trying to, so I get some mail and I'm looking at, whether email or physical mail, I'm looking at that in a different light. I'm walking around looking at signage. I'm deciding whether I think it's good or not. I'm listening to politicians yabber on about stuff. Is that good? Is the way Netflix has presented stuff to me, is that effective? Is it not effective? Is it annoying? And all these pieces. So it becomes this kind of overwhelming thing where every single thing is sort of, I'm viewing it through a behavioral lens, humorous. Is that making, and I'm guessing you must have a similar kind of piece, which is there's a little bit more awareness of this stuff than there would have been before you started this project. And almost like the kid in The Sixth Sense, right? Are you seeing this stuff everywhere?
Absolutely. Absolutely. So like one of the challenges for me, of course, is like, well, there are so many options. What am I going to write about this week? Right. I'm going to set aside the other 99 things that I might do and just focus on this one. And then the other impact, of course, is it's certainly destroyed many casual conversations I've had with people because the casual common kind of like chatter. When I start bringing out like, oh, haven't you thought about like this, and surely you're aware of this study from, and it's certainly destroyed a lot of those, pleasant interactions, unintended.
You're the sort of deeply irritating naysayer, right? So this is kind of like, he said, trying to make a poor positive. You're like the Jeff Goldblum character in movies, right? who basically is the side, and we've seen it Independence Day. And you've got it in Jurassic Park, and I'm sure he does it a few other places where he's kind of sitting there going, you haven't thought this through properly. And he's right, but he's really irritating. And he's proven it. So is that you? Is that what you're striving towards inadvertently? Is that an unintended consequence of this?
Hopefully I can control my irritation generation there. Yes. But that certainly happened. Because once you start digging, so like, in the news, and I've actually been really limiting my news intake, over the past month, and this might be something I continue to do because it was just too much of a distraction for me, right? But certainly in the news, you get a very cursory, this really high level kind of explanation. It's also tends to be like very much, okay, A happened, therefore B, next topic. It's they're right. So much of a robust discussion, typically. So I've ended up kind of stepping away from just taking in content, like that, because I felt it was just too distracting. But yes, I've certainly found that it's the writing that I've been doing is having that effect on the way I will think about other issues or talk about issues. I certainly have to remember that not everybody is, reading the things that I'm now reading or trying to model a system as I'm doing. But I would say some of the ability for certain ideas or business models to spread is just the ability to tell this very simple story. Okay, like the world as it is today is not so great. This future state is a lot better. We are making that happen. This is what we're doing. So taking that and, that in effect is the, quintessential kind of, startup, pitch, right? Here's the current world, the future is better, and this is what we're doing to make that. So that is, like in a nutshell, like what a lot of, companies do to raise money, to acquire customers, right? To get a lot of, excitement. Having, to be the person who then says, here are a few big factors that you haven't considered. I get why you're not considering them. They are completely contrary to you doing this business. I understand,
Right. They're unhelpful.
Yeah, they're not helpful
from that perspective
to you specifically. But yeah, I don't know. Once you start digging into those second order effects, I think, you'll look at the world in this very different way. You'll see, you'll walk down a street that seemed to be barren in the past, and it will be just like a jungle of different ideas and different elements that are interacting. So I enjoy it.
But it's interesting because you what you've basically articulated is the theoretical role of a risk manager. be their compliance officer, be their sort of risk manager within organizations, which is to spot risk. Mm-hmm. And so typically in an organization, whenever you're about to acquire another company, you're about to launch a new product, there'll be someone there who's responsible for kind of gatekeeping, who is supposed to keep you honest and look at things. And what I find interesting about it is that typically those, that involves a sort of legal check. So are we allowed to do this? And then there might be someone looking for a reputational risk, and maybe there's someone looking for an operational, but can we do this? And even when you get to the should we be doing this question, which is kind of critical, I think, nowadays, the sort of ethical piece there, just because it's legal doesn't mean it's necessary. That's starting to, what you're talking about is way outside the zone of normal contemplation, because if you're sat there in a meeting and they're say as the kind of Cassandra, if you like, calling this stuff, this could go horribly wrong. One is you will always have a narrative to come up with, right? So every single project that is ever suggested, there will be an Orlando theory as to what could go wrong. Right? So there's that sort of bit. And then the second bit is kind of like you're in an environment where everybody's pumped up and ready to go for this thing, particularly if you have a dominant CEO. So it's a really tough role to fulfill. But in essence, what you're doing is you're proposing something that is risk management. I don't know whether we're at 3.0 or 4.0, I don't know, but we're a thing where you're going, this needs to be a little bit further, which is you need to think outside the normal box and go beyond that point. But as I've said before, equally recognizing that every single idea you come up with has a potential Orlando narrative that is unhelpful. And so if we literally if we gave you a magic button to press every time something could be terrible, you'd be pressing it all the time for every single idea that came past your desk. And, the insurance industry is the one place where that happens. Okay, should we pay this out? Let's find a million reasons why we don't need to pay this thing out, right? There's your industry where that's a valuable skill. But it is an interesting challenge. But how does one introduce that function? But it's recognized as being valuable, clearly, because we have these structures. And I always talk about the sort of the court jester in the Middle Ages, whose job it was to basically tell the king or the queen to kind of rein it in a bit, and they were given a construct in which to do that. But even they couldn't go that far, because if they pushed it too far, they were being beheaded and their career path was running out. So I think there's an interesting challenge here, which is you've alighted upon something that in theory already exists, but we know in practice doesn't. And I think that's really interesting, because I think what we're seeing now with Corona and various other pieces is that some of those things that we might have deemed to be unlikely, impossible, once in a lifetime, 1 in a million chance, all that kind of stuff is happening and happening for real. So I wonder whether there isn't an appetite potentially to start going down the route you're suggesting.
I think so. And, as people write into me, who they discover my writing however they do, but as they write into me, like I've heard a number of stories, like this. And the your inclusion of the court jester example, it's the history of court jesters, they existed really around the world until I guess recently, relatively recently, or maybe somebody will kind of take that role in an unofficial way. But there was certainly a lot of value there, because it was the perhaps one person who could challenge the king, challenge the dominant train of thought, and just make people pause for a moment before everyone charged ahead. So I think there might be a little more appetite for that today. And I've also just in this whole process, especially in a coronavirus environment, I've just gotten interested in how easy it is to forget the lessons of the past.
Right.
So like in my own case, so a lot of the comparisons, at least early on, a lot of the comparisons to coronavirus were of the 1918 flu, or the Spanish flu, as it was called. In my own case, I actually had two grandparents who emigrated as adults from Spain, right? After, like shortly after, Spanish flu. And I kind of thought it would have come up in the past, in some way. And I was too young really, to know about this, of course, too young to ask the question. And now it's too late, in my case. But that, that history of that 1918 flu was something I didn't know about until SARS happened. And then there was a little blip of people bringing up this as an example. But that's an example of a massive, worldwide pandemic.
Right.
Tens of millions of people only a century ago. I'll say a century is pretty recent, even in American terms, maybe pretty recent, in terms of history. And that lesson was totally lost. It wasn't that we stopped doing certain things a certain way because we don't have to, do that. It was, we just completely forgot about it. It wasn't like a go-to example in the past. So I found like in the writing I'm doing now, like I end up digging into a lot of primary sources. I end up going to like, a report from 50 years ago, 100 years ago, in some cases like, 500 years ago, trying to get as close as I can to the experience on the ground in whatever event was taking place. I get that there's, there will always be surprises. We could not, it would be madness to try to really predict.
But it would also be a really bad world, right? Yeah. Because if everything was massively predictable, how dull would that be?
Dull.
So we kind of want a little bit of uncertainty and excitement and just sort of things not to be regular and predictable, because things that are regular and predictable are boring.
And they're not improving.
Up to a point, right? I get there's some things I don't want nuclear power stations to have a sense of excitement and energy. And I could do without the excitement. The corona thing is probably a little bit too much the other way. But
Sure. Yeah, and we wouldn't have improvements, like we wouldn't have innovation. So yes, we have to deal with a little bit of chaos, a little bit of uncertainty. Of course, it's just like at certain times where we know we are actually taking actions that have a massive top-down scale effect, where we are like building a new system that has like an incredible amount of risk, even though in theory it's operationally very efficient. What happens if a little thing goes wrong, right? Yeah.
And I think, it's very, as you were talking about the Spanish flu, it's fascinating. So I've been kind of digging into this for obvious reasons because it feels salient. And I thought as you were talking, actually, it's really interesting that one, it's a misnomer because it was, but actually the mere fact it's called the Spanish flu tells you something, right? This was a global thing because you wouldn't call it the Spanish flu if it had just been in Spain.
Right.
Because they wouldn't call it that because that would be an unnecessary adjective. And so I think that's a really clear example. And there is something strange about our inability to learn from the past. And I kind of look at that and say, history repeats itself. But if you go back to things like the Bible and the reason those stories are still relevant, and the context needs to shift slightly, but the stories are still relevant because we're just as dumb as our forefathers were in some cases, right? And none of us learn from this, and that's the human condition. We don't learn from this stuff. Right. So I think what you've sort of stumbled on is sort of the essence, quintessential nature of human beings, which is we'll learn from, if we've had a car accident, we'll drive a bit more carefully for a while. Mm-hmm. Because that feels, and then the memory kind of fades and we go back to where we were before. And I think this sort of, there's almost something in what you're picking up, which is basically just people are people. This stuff is going to happen. And so you're chronicling, if you like, just a 21st century manifestation of things that have been going on for a long time, albeit that what happens now is we've just put more power in people's fingertips.
Right.
And therefore, the consequences of those dynamics are potentially greater than they were before. You might have been able to do something stupid to wipe out your tribe, mm-hmm. but you weren't going to take the whole of humanity with you.
Exactly.
That's now changed.
Exactly. Yeah. That is really the comparison. If you go back to like biblical or like older, other like very old texts, that is really the difference. Like those scale effects, which were not present in the past, or at least not so much, they are present today. And so like that, we just have this, systemic risk that's kind of like built into the way that we live, now. And yeah, I don't think we're going back to those old days, or we wouldn't want to, of course. So as a result, having this, a little more of an appreciation for the way things might change unexpectedly, it makes sense, to start down, that mode of thinking today.
And has it changed the way you think about your own life and you think about your own decision making?
Oh, very good question.
I get one in each podcast. That was it.
Oh my.
You can say no. It's fine.
Ironically, I don't think it really has. And it might also be because, well, I'll tell you one thing. It has changed. It has changed for me. What it has changed for me is out of this whole experience and just this practice of writing every week, and meeting a lot of people along the way, I've just discovered that I love this, this broad topic or topic of topics. So it's it has certainly changed the way I look at things. Has it changed anything inward about me? Maybe not yet in my day-to-day activities, other than I kind of have my go-to activity that I do when I get up early in the morning. So otherwise, I mean, maybe I had a little hint of a little glimmer of a thought about, when we were choosing a place to live, okay, maybe I want to take global warming into account, that might be, that shakes out, the way people, so, perhaps I've thought of some things kind of like that, but inwardly, I guess not as much. Yeah.
I mean, you're living in California, right?
And living in California.
So that is already a judgment call on Mother Nature around that, because the big one is coming at some point, but then where is safe in the world, because there's different forms of risk. So this is the alternative narrative. It's not like you've chosen danger over safety. Everything is an interesting trade-off. And I asked that question not because I was expecting some kind of great Damascene conversion that you now risk manage every moment of your life, because that would make you weird, and actually you would be stymied from doing a whole load of things, because you'd be sitting there weighing up A versus B. We have to kind of make shortcuts. And I was thinking this through the other day in terms of if one you could assume the worst about everybody and sort of go, everybody is out to cheat me and I will treat everybody with innate suspicion. But that is not the basis on which you can afford to live your life, because at some point you have to trust someone, because you wouldn't be able to, you'd be constantly checking every single thing, and you wouldn't be able to build new relationships with people. So we sort of have to calibrate that thing. We sort of have to accept and live with a certain amount of inherent risk. And to some extent, actually, I wonder whether the way that you've taken it on board is subconsciously, and that it's not a kind of formal thing where you go, I will now switch. You've just kind of subsumed this stuff, and it probably doesn't feel any different. So you are the kind of frog in boiling water for this kind of stuff, which is you don't notice you're thinking about it in a slightly different way. I still happen to think that was a particularly cruel experiment. Whoever did that in the first place, I think ought to be struck off whatever scientific register that allowed them to make that experiment, if indeed it's true. But I think there's something interesting. It probably has got to you in a way that's just not immediately obvious, and that's probably the healthiest way to subsume it.
I think you're right.
And therefore maybe there's a lesson for how one could communicate that to other people, right? Which is if you come along and go, here is something new that you need to think about, right? They're going to go away, Paul, right? I have to, but I think there are probably ways one could subsume it into processes so it felt a bit more natural and manageable, because the scale of what you're asking people to think about, in the same way as my model of trusting everybody is impossible to operate under, I think, there's probably some room to kind of stealth it into processes and not try and cover everything, but at least have a greater awareness of it.
Definitely. Yeah, definitely. Yeah. In the meantime, I'm having a lot of fun, just like digging into these topics, discovering a lot of new things along the way. Certainly in going back to like some of the primary texts and then kind of relating them to things that we see happening now. It's definitely opened my eyes to both historical occurrences and also current day ones.
Fantastic. And look, the passion for it comes through, I think, two ways. One is when you talk about it very clearly. The second thing is you would not be doing this if it wasn't a labor of love and passion, because I think the effort that you put in, just the writing, but the research and everything else around it, it is an absolutely wonderfully, lovingly curated project. And I think one of the things that really does scream through when you talk about it, but also when you read it, is that, you're not doing this to impress anyone else. You're doing this because you genuinely believe in it. And I think that just screams across. And I think that's a lovely note on which to end the episode of the podcast. So thank you so much for doing what you do, because it is a real pleasure as it lands in my inbox, it is one of those ones that I look at and go, I'm going to read this and devour it because I'm going to learn something new. But I've loved having a conversation with you, because that's also brought some other aspects. So thank you for both of those things.
Oh, thank you. That's very kind of you. I certainly appreciate, getting to speak with you today and being on your wonderful podcast. Thank you very much.
So that's it for another episode of the Human Risk Podcast. My huge thanks to Paul for appearing and to you for listening. To find Paul's blog, Unintended Consequences, there's a link in the show notes. As I say, highly recommended stuff. If this is your first time listening to the Human Risk Podcast, welcome. If you'd like to subscribe, you'll find it on all of the major platforms. If you haven't left a review for the show and would like to do so, please do. It really helps attract high-quality guests and allows other people to find the show. I'll see you very soon on this channel for another episode of the Human Risk Podcast.